Today we're going to be talking about the world wars. You'll notice I've already put up a very exciting map on the wall. There's a story behind these maps because there are going to be others. They happen to have, there's going to be maps of Europe and between the wars, and they happen to have been, they happen to have cost Cato an enormous amount of money. Someone convinced, and Ed is very mad about it, someone convinced Roy Childs that they were the original maps used by Hitler to invade Russia. But since we have them, we might as well use them. My topic this morning is going to be Europe and the world in the 20th century. The great century of statism. And I'm going to start by discussing the First World War. The First World War, historians increasingly recognize, was a watershed, and the great watershed of 20th century history. What came out of the First World War was, first of all, the establishment of communism in a great power, Russia. It's extremely doubtful that Lenin and his few thousand Bolsheviks could ever have come to power in Russia except for the dislocations and chaos produced by a losing war on the part of the Tsarist government. Also out of the First World War came fascism in Italy and the fascist movement throughout Europe because of a vindictive peace treaty. After a little more than a decade, the Nazis came to power in Germany, and with them the seeds of World War II, also to be found in the First World War. And more generally and abstractly, throughout the world, there came, throughout the came state planning on an unprecedented scale. By 1900, we already witnessed the twilight and decline and lingering death of classical liberalism in the Atlantic world. Liberalism had been in decline since around 1870, if we take the date proposed by the British legal historian Dicey. By the 1890s, a British liberal politician could say, "We are all socialists now." One of the things that had aided in the demise of liberalism was the rise in the 1880s of the welfare state. This was the idea of the German statesman Otto von Bismarck. And it's interesting that people don't consider the origins of the welfare state a little more closely. Bismarck, after all, was a militarist, an authoritarian, a man who distrusted liberalism and parliamentary government, and initiated and pioneered the welfare state. It's as if the time had come in the history of economic development where there was a possibility that the average person and the average working person could finally become independent, self-reliant, the master of his own fate, because of the progress of industrial capitalism. And it was at that point that Bismarck reattached the masses to the state through welfare legislation, and again made them reliant on the state for pensions, sort of pensioners of the state, people who were going to be tied to the state through gratitude for all the benefits the state gave them. You see that? It could have been a different development, but the welfare state came in there to reattach the masses of people to the government in gratitude for these benefits. Bismarck was aided along these lines by the rise in Germany of academics called socialists of the chair. That is, they weren't socialists like the Marxist socialists in the street. They were very prominent professors. As a matter of fact, they were anti-Marxist, but they did preach the kind of socialism and pro-state ideology that George Smith was talking about last time as having been preached in the United States. The need for centralization, the need for state control in the economy. These ideas are spreading throughout the Western world. And there are some significant dates in the first decade or so of the century. as far as the leadership of the international liberal movement goes. Lord Acton dies. In 1903, Herbert Spencer dies. One of his last essays had been an attack on the imperialist British effort in the Boer War. And Herbert Spencer says, all my life I was a British patriot in the sense that England was the home of many individual liberties. It was the home of the respect for the industrious, enterprising middle class, but my British patriotism died in the imperialist Boer War. In 1906, the last great German liberal, Eugen Richter, dies. He had voted against von Tirpitz's naval buildup in the last few years in the Reichstag. And in one of his last speeches, he says, if we let the banner of liberalism fall, we who are the last, then who will take it up again? And there was to be nobody who would take it up again. And what is to happen in the next decades in Germany to Richter's beloved German people and by Richter's German is a true tragedy. It's not anything that a classical liberal of the time could have imagined the decades to come in this awful 20th century. In 1910, William Graham Sumner dies, and one of his last acts had been a decade before to attack the Spanish-American War, the American annexation of the Philippines, and the war, the least known war, the war we waged for 3 or 4 years against the Philippine people in order to subdue them to American rule. In 1912, Gustave de Molinari, the great Belgian-French economist, and the dean of the classical liberal school of French economists in his time, dies also. Around this time, one of the last liberals who's left, the Italian Pareto, says everyone is a socialist. They're either revolutionary socialists or they're nationalist and protectionist socialists. But there's no one who believes in the free society in Europe anymore. This is the period also of the growth of imperialism. The famous rebirth of imperialism after a kind of lull in the middle of the 19th century, actually largely caused by classical liberal ideas and values. After around 1880, imperialism becomes not only an important movement again, it becomes a frenzy, especially as we approach the end of the century and the first years of the 20th century. There are a number of reasons for this rebirth of imperialism. You understand what's involved, especially the scramble for Africa, as it's called. A number of reasons for this. One is that it begins to drift back and then steadily, gradually, more and more quickly towards protectionism. The era of pretty much universal free trade is a very, very short one, just about in the middle of the century. In 1979, Bismarck in the new great unified German Reich decides to go over to a protective tariff. In the years that follow, France, which had always been tempted to do so, had been a classical country of protectionism, does the same. Russia, Austria-Hungary, and other countries. Now, you understand that with a regime of protectionism, this makes imperialism much more likely. If there's universal free trade, then it doesn't really make very much of a difference who owns a particular colony, in the sense of who has military or political sovereignty over it. If we have a regime of universal free trade, then it doesn't really make much of a difference whether Britain owns Jamaica or France owns Jamaica, or Jamaica is independent. Okay? Because the Jamaicans will buy goods in the cheapest market, and they will sell goods in the dearest market, regardless of the nationality of the suppliers and the buyers. So the imperialist country only has the expense of keeping up the government, exercising political jurisdiction, having a military garrison there, and so on. There is no economic advantage to any major group in the home country. With protectionism, it's different, and you can force some captive area in Africa to buy from you rather than from someone else. This does help certain elite groups in the home market. So with the growth of protectionism, there's a concomitant growth of imperialism. Another element that's involved, a political element of the time, is the fact that France had been defeated in the War of 1871, which led to the unification of Germany and created this great unified German Reich right in the middle of Europe. And overseas expansion was a way for the French to sort of reestablish their pride. Okay, they had been defeated by the Germans. They were no longer the premier nation on the continent of Europe, but after all, they had the Foreign Legion in Algeria. They had a navy in Indochina. They were taking big chunks of Africa. And the French were one of the leaders of imperialism at the time. Now, as far as imperialism goes, there's a famous movement at around 1900 that's important in the history of thought that seeks to link imperialism very closely with capitalism. Okay? This includes some number of Marxist authors and also an important British so-called liberal, called himself a liberal at this time. It's an indication of how far liberalism had come. The German Hilferdink writes a book called Finance Capital. The Polish Marxist Rosa Luxemburg, the same. The most famous is the book that Lenin himself writes in 1917, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. At around the same, around 1902, a British radical, that is not Marxist, but radical, named J.A. Hobson, writes Imperialism, a Study. And this is all an attempt to debit imperialism to the account of capitalism. And it's interesting, in the history of thought, the circumstances under which this comes up. Joseph Schumpeter was a great economist, a great social philosopher, wrote a book called Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy after the Second World War. He makes a very interesting statement. He says, capitalism stands trial before judges who already have the sentence of death in their pocket. And what I take that to mean, as he explains, is that regardless of the charge that's made against capitalism, the time comes when capitalism, let's say the market basically, is acquitted of that charge, a new charge will be brought up. And an indefinite number of charges until the guilty verdict is reached and the verdict of, and the sentence of death is pronounced. Around 1900, it had become obvious that the Marxist predictions about the market were not coming true. Okay? It was not the case that the middle class was disappearing, that total monopoly was coming into existence. It was not the case that the business cycle had reached the point of collapse of the capitalist system. Above all, it was not the case that the workers were getting poorer and poorer. That's what Marx and Engels had said in the 1840s. They never changed their view, but by 1900, you simply could not deny the evidence of your senses. The working class in capitalist societies was becoming richer and richer. Okay, so that set of accusations and charges against capitalism has to be put aside. And the revisionists, as they were called, in Germany and in other places, led by the moderate Marxist Bernstein, say we cannot use these charges against capitalism anymore, unfortunately. All right? Right, but the sentence of death is still there. You have to have some charge to give the sentence, to justify the sentence. And the new charge then arose. Capitalism may not be responsible for the collapse of the economy or cartelization or the poverty of the working class, which are not real facts, but it is responsible for a new horror and evil called imperialism. So this charge of imperialism then takes the place of the older discredited charges, with always the same psychological background, which is that there's no way this defendant is going to get off the hook. Whatever charge we have to bring up. When I was a kid, it was the affluent society. Okay, that's before the war on poverty was discovered. It was not only the affluent society, it was the contemptible taste of American consumers in preferring tail fins on their cars. This was the message of John Kenneth Galbraith in those days. All of these awful things are supposed to prove something rotten and decadent about capitalism. Now, according to these theorists, what was responsible for imperialist expansion was the need of capitalist economies to place investments overseas. Okay, the need, because of the falling rate of profit, to find areas in the third world that would bring profitable investment. So this capital flow was supposed to bring the capitalists there. Once the capitalists are there, the capitalists look around and say, it's better if our own government, our own system of laws here, will work together with the politicians and force them to take over this area. Now, since these theories were developed around 1900 and between 1900 and 1917, let's say, historians, that is not theorists or polemicists like, of course, Lenin, but actual historians have been at work on this thesis to try to test it. And I've actually done some work. In fact, I teach a course on theories of imperialism. The fact of the matter is, when it comes to testing this thesis by actual empirical work, the thesis collapses at every point. And I can refer you to the works of D.K. Fieldhouse, for instance, a British economist. The Theory of Capitalist Imperialism is his book. Okay, an older book in the 20s, Eugene Staley, Imperialism and the Private Investor. And there are specific books for specific countries. As far as France goes, the French historian Brunswick, Henri Brunswick. Okay, and a very nice little book has recently been published last year by Oxford University Press that very neatly summarizes many of these issues. It's a translation from a German historian named Baumgart. Okay, and it's called Imperialism, a nice short treatment really, summarizing many of the findings. What conclusion did these historians come to? First of all, it is impossible, it's inconceivable to explain the imperialism of many of the imperialist powers of the time through the need for overseas capital investment, because these countries were net capital importers. There was no such thing as a capital glut in Russia. If not the chief imperialist country of the time, certainly one of the most important imperialist countries of the time. Russia was an enormous importer of capital, especially from Western Europe. No capital glut in Japan, which had become an imperialist power. No capital glut in Italy. Italy became an imperialist power at the time. The Italians, these things have a sort of division of labor about them. The Italians, around 1900, specializing in the collection of deserts. Why deserts? Well, they must know it in Rome, but Eritrea, Somalia, and Libya. There was very little capital for export in Germany. As a matter of fact, when the time came for the Germans to get the concession from the Ottoman government to build the railroad to Baghdad, okay, there wasn't enough free German capital for export available. They had to call in French capitalists also. Okay. The United States, by the way, at the time, was a net capital importer also, still, by 1900. Then, of the countries which did export capital, where did that capital go? To these third world areas? By no means. French capital went almost exclusively to Southwest and Southern Europe, to the Balkans, and very largely, maybe about 40% of it, to Russia. Not to any area that they're taking over imperialistically, but to these other areas. British capital, for instance, went to the old empire, that is Canada, India, Australia, and so on, to the United States, to Argentina, but again, not to these areas which were being taken over imperialistically at the time. So there is really no connection between this alleged need to place capital and imperialist expansion. In fact, the question of imperialism at this time is much more complicated. Occasionally it is the case that some capitalists will go to the government and say, we would like you to take over this area, we need to expand in this area. This was the case, for instance, in connection with some German expansion in the Pacific, which was encouraged by the shipping lines in Hamburg. But by and large, this was not an important factor in connection with the new imperialism of 1880 on. And the question really is complicated. The factors involved vary from case to case. In the case of British West Africa, it is largely an attempt by the British to take over territories because the French are expanding, and the French, once they take over some territory, do establish a protectionist system. The British rely on free trade, but the British preemptively take over, so they're not excluded by French protectionism. That's West Africa. When it comes to East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and so on, the main reason is strategic, as Robinson and Gallagher show in their book on Africa and the Victorians. Strategic, the defense of the Sudan, which is necessary for the defense of Egypt, which is necessary for the defense of the Suez Canal. It's in the defense of the Suez Canal and the routes to India. The Suez Canal itself, by the way, the British took it over and occupied Egypt in 1882, not primarily for economic reasons whatsoever, as Disraeli himself said, but for strategic reasons. The Suez Canal was going to be used to quickly shuttle troops between the British Army in India and the European theater, whenever it was necessary. The Sepoy Mutiny had only been about 15 years before. So there might be a mutiny in India, you want to shuttle troops there, or bring them to the European theater to block Russia or whatever. Okay, so strategic and military reasons were involved. But not capitalism in any form, and certainly not the free market. Certainly not free market capitalists, really, by definition. But not even state capitalists to any large extent in this period of imperialism. It was the old reasons of state, as they say. Military reasons, strategic reasons, reasons of prestige, reasons of loving the idea of a strong state. This is the period of public education. In every little schoolhouse in Europe, and now in America at this time, not before, I learned recently, you had the flag of your country. Before the end of the 19th century, the American flag was not typically displayed in public schoolhouses. But in every country, you have the flag of your country. You have a map of the world with various areas of the world colored in the same color as your own country, which, you know, is so beautiful it almost makes you want to cry. That Italy should own 1 million square miles of desert in the north, 500,000 square miles of desert in the east. The time will come when deserts are going to be very rare, and Italy will have the world by the throat. Okay? So, through the public school systems, which are expanding in every country, through conscription, which brings people into the army for a few years, indoctrinates them, this idea of the grandeur, the necessary grandeur of imperialist expansion is spread to the mass of people. It's something which the people take up really as actively as the politicians do. But the chief pushers of the specific acts of imperialism, according to the historical record, are the military leaders, the civilian politicians, the special nationalist groups which are set up. In Germany, the Navy League has over 1 million members by the time of the First World War. These are people in every walk of life who, for sentimental, emotional, nationalist reasons, push the imperialism of their own country. These imperialist rivalries create hostilities and antipathies among the powers, especially when the imperialism is something that occurs in Europe itself. You understand, it's not only overseas that you can set up colonies, okay, but by expansion in Europe. And any kind of attempted expansion in Europe is infinitely more dangerous at this time than in Africa or the Pacific or East Asia. This imperialism by 1914 has been going on for 3.5 decades or more. Everybody is used to it. Everybody almost endorses it. Another important thing that exists on the eve of war in 1914, and really what immediately brings about the World War, is the alliance system of the European powers. The European powers have engaged in collective security now for a number of decades. Bismarck is thrown out of office by the new Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890. But by the time he leaves, he has created a number of alliances in order to preserve the status quo, which he thinks is to the benefit of Germany. Germany has an alliance called the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary. I don't know if you can see this here. This is an old country that is destroyed by the First World War called Austria-Hungary, ruled by the Habsburgs. The Habsburg family, which is the most famous name in the history of Europe. I think that's a nice thing to have, the most famous name in the history of Europe. And composed of a number of different small nationalities. Okay? So Bismarck has an alliance with Austria-Hungary and with Italy also, called the Triple Alliance. He has, on the side, an alliance with Russia. The whole aim is to isolate France, to prevent the French from somehow starting up trouble in order to gain back their lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. In 1871, when the unified Germany comes into existence, the Germans take away from France 1.5 provinces over here, called Alsace. That's a whole province with the capital of Strasbourg, and part of Lorraine with the town of Metz. This is an intense humiliation to the French. Bismarck says, look, it'll take them a long time to forget this. In the meantime, let's make it so that they can't cause any trouble by isolating them from any possible allies. The British at this time sort of are engaged in splendid isolation, would not be involved in any alliances on the continent. So Bismarck has done what he wanted to do. He has alliances with the powers over here, separately with Russia. England is minding its own business, and France is not in a position by itself to attack Germany. Once Bismarck is dismissed, things start to change very quickly. The new Kaiser and his advisors decide that it's impossible to come to terms both with Austria-Hungary, they're involved in this alliance, and with Russia, they're involved in that alliance, and they choose Austria-Hungary as ultimately the more dependable country, and they say, look, there's no chance that France is going to ally with Russia. Right? France is the only great republic in Europe. It is a democratic country. Russia is an absolutism. To give you an example of how ludicrous, it is in Russia at this time against the law to play the Marseillaise in public. Okay, because the Marseillaise is a revolutionary song. So there's no chance these two countries are going to ally. Okay? Let's go with Austria-Hungary and as the more dependable Germanic power. So in 1890, the treaty with Russia is permitted to lapse. 2 years later, the Russians and the French sign an alliance. And very quickly it becomes a military alliance. And Bismarck in his last years sees the nightmare beginning to materialize, what he always considered the nightmare, and that was the possibility of a two-front war, with Germany in the middle. On this side, the second best army in the world, and on this side, by far the largest army in the world. This alliance system intensifies as we approach 1914. More and more, each group considers itself separate and hostile camp. After the turn of the century, after around 1900, a very, very bright and very ambitious and very aggressive French foreign minister named Delcasse brings about a brilliant coup, and that is not the alliance, the understanding, the entente with England. Not a formal binding alliance, as the French-Russian alliance is, but an understanding that increasingly, as time goes on, brings the two countries closer and closer together, and their leaders closer and closer together. This entente comes into existence in 1904. So you have Germany still with its rather weak allies to the south, but France now becomes a kind of hinge that has an alliance with Russia and an understanding with England. And in 1907, the French want to bring their two friends together, and England and Russia come to an agreement about all outstanding colonial problems, begin to grow closer and closer together. So by 1914, what you have is an alliance system composed of the Triple Alliance in the middle of Europe and what comes to be known as the Triple Entente, okay, with France, England, and Russia. If we had a map of the world, and not simply a map of Europe, this would appear to you, I think, much more dramatically. Because what you see on a map of the world is Europe, of course, as a very small peninsula jutting out of the vast mass of Asia. Okay, and what you see is Germany as about the size of a thumb. If this were a map of the world, Germany would be the size of a thumbnail. Okay, and what does the world look like from the German point of view? Okay, one quarter of the globe is colored pink. Okay, that is the British Empire on which the sun never sets. It includes whole continents like Australia. Okay, the next largest empire, the French. Okay, and then on the eastern side of Germany, what? Russia, the Russian Empire. Stretching from the German border to the Sea of Japan, going through 11 time zones, 1/6 of the land surface of the globe. Things look rather frightening from the German point of view, actually. This creates a tension, a suspicion in Germany that's going to be very dangerous when the last days of July come about of 1914. By the way, this is something we should keep in mind. That is, what does the world, to take a similar example in our own time, what does the world look like from the Soviet point of view? If we had a map of the world. Well, the Soviet Union is in the position that the United States would be if on our northern border we had not Canada and the sweet Canadian people, but China, okay? If on our southern border we had not Mexico, but the nations of NATO assembled, led by Germany. And if Cuba were not Cuba, but Japan. Okay? That is the position the Soviet Union feels itself to be in. Do you understand what I'm saying? The position we'd be in if we had China on one border, NATO led by Germany on another, and instead of this little island of Cuba, Japan were there. That's the position of encirclement which the Soviet Union finds itself in. I'm not saying this justifies anything, but we ought to understand the psychology of people who are in a position to make very dangerous decisions. We would understand how things look to them from their point of view. And after 1907, the world looks like an extremely dangerous place to the Germans. There's a kind of sense of encirclement that comes about. Also, what's been going on is an armaments race. Okay, now, most of the people in this room were born, I think virtually everybody of you were born into a world where an armaments race was a normal part of life, right? That is, of course, every year you build more and more in the way of ships and planes and tanks and so on in order to forestall some enemy. This was not the case in the 19th century, in the liberal 19th century. Armaments budgets kept going down and down and down through most of the century, unless there was some war in the offing, some war of national unification, let's say. But with the collapse of liberalism and the growth of imperialism and militarism, the nations of the world begin to engage in very threatening arms races. Okay, every country wants to build a huge ocean-going navy, and the British want to maintain their standard of a navy equal to that of the next two largest navies put together. You can see that that will tend to get out of control, that sort of arms race. Conscription has been introduced into every European country except Britain, and we have mass armies, mass standing armies, and enormous reserves of trained soldiers, people who have been through the conscript system and are ready there to be called back to the colors. The armaments budgets just keep getting larger and larger, and every country thinks every other country is spending more than they are. Is frightened of every new development, every new change in the design of a rifle. With these great armies that are there, standing armies in the army already or latently there, ready to be brought into existence in a few days. In other words, as the years pass, approaching 1914, Europe is on a hair trigger. A hair trigger. Anything could start the armies moving. But nobody believes that, because Europe has been through a number of crises and has survived them all. Okay? There are the crises over Morocco. Morocco is this Arab country here in northwest Africa, which the French want to take over. The Germans say, look, there's not that much territory left in the world. You can't simply take it over. The French say, okay, we'll give you something. But